All of a sudden, I get a message that says, "We have a job open at Amazon, and I think you might be a fit." I flew to Seattle. I spent 8 hours locked in an office that I'm pretty sure was actually a broom closet, and I interviewed my ass off. I was confused, I was disoriented. It was the craziest experience I'd ever had in my entire life, and it was a whirlwind, and I got the job. I was hired to develop what was then called Timex and would become known as Amazon Global. And I spent the next 4 years building that business to an $11 billion business from scratch. I was frustrated at Amazon at that point. I just wanted to do more and move fast, and Amazon was changing. It was becoming corporate. It was no longer a startup. We had project management and program management and this MPI process, and things got slow and political, and it wasn't for me anymore. So I left after 7 years. I was pretty burned out. I built multiple multi-billion-dollar businesses in those 7 years, and I was pretty good. But I learned so much about life, about supply chain, and about leadership in that role. Hi, this is Kimberly Reuter, business advisor and supply chain expert, and welcome to my new podcast, The Morning Mood. I am super excited that you're here. I've actually been working on a podcast on and off for about 5 years, believe it or not. That never took off. I partnered with people, conflicting ideas, other stuff got in the way. A lot of reasons. I do currently podcast with Supply Chain Now. I'm a co-host. I love that. Tune into that. But I've been really trying to do this for a while. And so I'm excited to do it my way with my own team. And this is what the morning mood will be about. We are going to discuss three different topics. We will be discussing supply chain, obviously, since that is my area of expertise, leadership, which I have a ton of experience in, and life, because I have certainly learned a lot of life lessons. So, those will be our three topics for the morning mood: supply chain, leadership, and life. I will have guests come in and speak about those specific topics, people that I have worked with in the past or partnered with in the past on some amazing projects. Some of the early builders and architects of Amazon will be joining me. So please stay tuned to hear their amazing stories. So it's going to be a fun time. The style of the morning mood will be casual, no hair and makeup. The reason for that is because when I have to go do hair and makeup, it ruins the creative process for me. And then now I'm so focused on not really what matters because it's a podcast. And you're probably going to be driving or doing your own makeup while you listen to this. So this will not be a beauty show, no hair and makeup. The style will be 100% authentic and heartfelt. If you know me or if you've worked with me in the past, you know that I'm a pretty authentic and transparent person. That is what this podcast is going to be about. And that will be the style of this podcast. There's going to be some cussing because as many of my second language is cussing. So we'll try to keep it to a minimum. I know Gary Vee set the bar on that and not going to try to compete. But if you're sensitive to the bad words, you might want to put a filter on or something. This is about authenticity. This is about heartfelt conversations. And the other thing about this podcast is that it will be no more than about 20 minutes. I don't really wanna listen to myself for more than 15. I can't imagine that you wanna listen to me longer than that. So the whole idea for this podcast is to be a morning conversation. This is no hour and a half long workshop. Why am I doing a podcast? Why would you be interested in hearing what I have to say? And what the hell makes me think that I have something interesting to put out there? I'm not sure I have anything interesting to put out there yet. We're gonna find out. And obviously, I need some feedback from you. If there's something that you wanna hear, I need to build my audience, which I'm excited to do with you. So about me, I grew up in rural Virginia, in the marshes, tidewater of Virginia. I graduated a high school of about 250 kids. I went to Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, where I didn't learn a lot about academics, but I learned a lot about life. I also learned that I don't learn very well sitting in a classroom. Probably some early learning challenges that we didn't really think about back then in the early 90s. I started my career in the international shipping industry. I started out with a little company called T. Parker Host in Norfolk, Virginia, as, get this, a telex operator. This is before we had, I think we might have had sat phones maybe back then, but this is before cell phones and all that kind of communication. So we had to sell in these telexes and you paid by the letter and the word. And so you sort of this cryptic Western Union sort of style of communication. And so that's how I started in the international business, was sending telexes to cargo ships. And then I moved into the imports. And when I was about 27, I got my broker's license and I got it in Norfolk, Virginia. I hadn't planned to get my broker's license. I was working for a company called Rogers and Brown at the time, and they saw some potential and said, "We want you to send for your broker's license, and we're going to help you prepare for it." They had a whole class that they did annually, and I took it and I passed on the first time. I was disappointed because I got a 97, and the highest grade in the company had been a 98. And I was disappointed that I didn't meet that. So, if you're wondering how I became such a type A personality, that's probably where it started. So, young at getting my broker's license, but jumped right into it, moved to Baltimore and started running a brokerage operation about a year later. And I spent about 15 years in the broker and freight forward industry, bouncing around from small regional Rogers and Brown to the big guys, Kuehne and Nagel and Expeditors. And I worked with a bunch of different companies on their import processes. Black& and Decker, Michelin Tire, Ford, a lot of really great exposure and opportunity. And I also learned from some amazing people about imports, how to run imports, how to be in front of imports. So many teachers along the way. So after about 15 years of doing the freight forwarding business, I moved over to a company at the time that was called Vastera, which was one of the first supply chain compliance. They were one of the early IPOs, the whole Reston, Virginia corridor IPO from the 90s. And so they were recruiting for a product manager. And I had been working with them. They were also a provider to Black& and Decker. So I went to go work for Vastera, and that was my introduction to technology and managing, being a product manager, managing technology. I had no idea what any of that stuff was about, but I knew supply chain and they needed people with supply chain experience. So I spent a couple of years at Vastera, and then it happened. In 2005, I was working for Expeditors, probably in the mid late 90s, working on the Ford account and flying back and forth to Detroit, working on import process improvements for the Ford import process. And I met a gentleman by the name of Mike McKenna during those trips to Detroit. Mike, the founding principal of Tradewin Consulting, Expeditors Tradewin Consulting. I was working for Expeditors at the time. And I got to know Mike through my work at Ford. Mike left Expeditors, I left Expeditors. We stayed in touch. We were both from the East Coast, we're sailors. We had a lot in common. And so we stayed in touch every month or so. We would chit chat. I get a message that says, "We have a job open at Amazon, and I think you might be a fit." Mike and I have a phone call, and he says, "I think you might be a good fit for this job. It's very competitive." He goes, "I know only two people who could potentially do this job, and you're one of them." I don't know who the other person was. And so I hopped on a plane. I flew to Seattle. I spent 8 hours locked in an office that I'm pretty sure was actually a broom closet. And I interviewed my ass off. I was confused. I was disoriented. It was the craziest experience I'd ever had in my entire life. And it was a whirlwind. And I got the job, which I was like, what? I wasn't even looking for a job. I interviewed in October. In December, I picked up out of Annapolis, Maryland, and moved to Seattle. And that's where my Amazon career started. I was hired at Amazon to build a program at the time they were calling Timex, which was basically a duty calculation at checkout. They had a very base model of it. It wasn't very successful. They weren't getting a lot of cooperation within the company and from the merchants and participating in the program. And it just couldn't really get off the ground. So I was hired to develop what was then called Timex and would become known as Amazon Global. And I spent the next 4 years building that business to an $11 billion business from scratch. $11 billion in 4 years with 2 engineers And about 2 years in, I got an employee, a product manager. This was at a time when Amazon was still a startup. There were 6,000 corporate employees in Seattle. We ran fast. We didn't have program management. We didn't have project management. We had product and we had people writing code. That was it. It was about a year and we had an import crisis. And everybody was like, we know who knows how to imports. That would be Kim. And so, about a year after being at Amazon, I was then told that I needed to run and build an import department. Amazon did not import prior to that. They had about 25 containers they imported a year for some private label stuff, but they really didn't have imports. And so I then built the import department for Amazon. And the processes, the partners that I built almost 20 years ago are still in place and still being used. And it is still the model and the foundation, how it's still used today is infinitely scalable. And what we built and what we implemented is so solid that it continues to serve that company and has grown a thousandfold since when I built it almost 20 years ago. So then we have the operations experience. Eventually, I also was responsible for product compliance and hazmat at Amazon. And also keep in mind that these responsibilities were worldwide. But if there was an audit, we were the ones who got called. So very intense and very interesting time at Amazon, building and architecting the global supply chain in backwards and forward, import and export for Amazon. And that encompassed so many other things, accounting, tax, software, understanding how 220 different countries work. It was a wild time. After that, I moved over to build Amazon Global FBA and Amazon Global Selling. Global FBA allowed FBA sellers to move their inventory and sell across borders. And global selling allowed them to actually set up in a global marketplace. One was I'm going to sit here in the United States or in another country and I'm going to sell my product like Amazon does all over the world. That was global FBA. And then global selling was I'm going to actually move my inventory to another country and sell on the Amazon marketplace. And so I developed those two programs with the FBA program. And both of those businesses grew very quickly. Those were towards the end of my career. I was frustrated at Amazon at that point. I just wanted to do more and move fast, and Amazon was changing. It was becoming corporate. It was no longer a startup. We had project management and program management and this MPI process, and things got slow and political, and it wasn't for me anymore. So I left after 7 years. I was pretty burned out. I built multiple multi-billion dollar businesses in those 7 years, and I learned so much about life, about supply chain, and about leadership in that role. So after I got done with Amazon, I took a break and I went on to work at Nordstrom. I got recruited by Nordstrom. At the time, Nordstrom was doing an e-commerce shakedown, and we're looking for little sticks of dynamite to push the company forward in their growth and e-commerce strategy. So I spent 4 years at Nordstrom really changing and leading and guiding Nordstrom into how to think like an e-commerce company, how to operate like an e-commerce company. And mostly my work that I did with Nordstrom was on the technology side, believe it or not. I did not get very heavily involved in the actual supply chain operations. My work was on the technology and the change leadership side at Nordstrom. I worked a lot with the Nordstrom brothers, with the executive team, and shaping and crafting how Nordstrom needed to move forward to be successful for another 100 years. So I spent 4 years at Nordstrom. It was fabulous. I learned so much about luxury retail. I built a gorgeous closet of designer clothes. I got addicted to some pretty expensive makeup and skincare. Thank you very much. I don't think I will never be able to retire now because of that. But it was fabulous. And again, I call it my finishing school. I'm just going to be straight up with y'all. I call Nordstrom my finishing school. I was pretty rough coming out of Amazon. I'm still kind of rough, to be honest with you. But I was pretty rough coming out of Amazon where it was just an NFL playoff every goddamn day. So I spent 4 years at Nordstrom, and throughout my years at Nordstrom, I was frustrated. And people kept saying to me, "You should start a consulting company. You should be a consultant." And one day, I decided to be a consultant, and I quit my job at Nordstrom and I started CSG Consulting, which stands for Clarity, Scale, Growth. And over the next 8 years, I built a consulting business. I made $1 million off my own back, which I know isn't that big of a deal, but as a solopreneur and an all cash business with no expenses, it was cool to say that I could do $1 million on my own back by myself. So that was quite the accomplishment with the consulting business. It took about 6 years for me to do that. And I was really surprised that I could build a consulting business. I have worked from everything from fresh off the funding startups to Fortune 500 companies and everything in between. And it has been a wild ride. It's been fascinating. I've set up companies in Europe. It's been a wild ride with the consulting, and I loved every minute of it. So now I am jumping into keynote speaking, and I am starting a podcast to share with you all of that stuff that I just told you about, which is all pretty fascinating, fantastic accomplishments. And those are cool, but it's the stories behind those that I want to bring to you. It's the lessons that I learned. It's the people that I met and became friends with through all of that that I want to bring to you. I don't often talk about myself or talk about my background. I have to hire people to write resumes for me. Very bad at it. I don't brag about myself very much. But I wanted to tell you about me so that you could understand why my perspective might be worthy. As I said, I moved from Annapolis, Maryland to Seattle. I spent 15 years in Seattle. I lived on Bainbridge Island, which was super exciting. I took a ferry to work every day and I rode a bicycle, which was a lifestyle that I absolutely adored. And I got to ride my bike through Pike Place Market every morning as they were setting up all the flower booths and the fish booths. And it was a very special experience. It's something I will never have again. I cherish that very much. So I now actually reside in Virginia. I moved back to the marshlands tides of the Chesapeake. She called me home about 5 years ago. And so now I live on the shores of the Potomac River. I am close to my Chesapeake Bay, which is my heart and soul. And I work in my home office. I consult. I have keynote speaking. I now have a podcast. And the thing that makes me most happy is that I help my local community. I have helped 3, 4, almost, yeah, 5 local watermen start e-commerce businesses, selling their oysters online, helping them make money. One of them is $1 million a year business itself. In 5 years, with my help, he was able to build $1 million a year revenue. Now, for this particular guy, he's doing 15, 20 million a year anyway. Don't underestimate Waterman, by the way. And so the million is a great ad, but he was already doing great on his own. So I can't take all that credit. But that is probably the thing that makes me feel the warmest is my help in the work that I do with the local people here and helping people achieve their dreams through e-commerce. So that is me. That is about our podcast. As I told you, it's going to be less than 20 minutes. So I got to wrap this up here quick because I do not want to take all of your time. But that is what the morning mood is going to be about. And I hope that you will join me Monday through Friday every morning to hear what I've got to say. So that is all for today. And I will talk to you tomorrow.